hour.
Okie doke. Let's have fun.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Two Rivers Virtual Events. We have Christopher Beha tonight. His new book is The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. And our very own Rob Neyer from St. John's, author of Powerball, is going to be doing the introductions and the questions. First, I'm going to turn it over to Rob in a sec, but I want to do a little PSA. Saturday is Independent Bookstore Day. Come on down. We have special items. We have special items online for Independent Bookstore Day. And we just moments ago had a cameo from the actual Roosevelt High School baseball coach. All of the funds that we received tonight will be going to Roosevelt High School's athletic program. So thank you so much for signing up, and know that this is going to a good cause. And I am going to turn this over to Rob. Thank you, everyone, for showing up. Thank you, Chris, for being here.
Thank you, Christine. My name's Rob Neyer, as Christine said. I do live here in St. John's. Bookstore is. I'm getting. That's worse. Okay. Sorry about that. I'll just suffer.
Do you have how many devices do you have going?
Just the one.
Huh. Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm just hearing myself twice, but I'm sure I will get used to it, and it'll work. Oh, I just lost my notes, though. Hold on. All right.
It's probably because you have the mic on the computer and the mic on your headset.
Oh, this has never happened before. Let me see how to change that. Does it sound okay from your end?
Yeah.
Then I won't worry about it. So this is a thrill for me. I had no idea when I read this wonderful novel, the moment it came out, that I would get a chance to talk to Christopher Beha. I think I actually forgot that the title was based on something that Bill James invented. I must have read that somewhere. It's a little intimidating, Chris, because for me, a great novelist is a sort of magician, creating this world that seems so real, but isn't. I can't do that sort of thing. That's why all my books are based on facts and numbers and all those things. But this was a real thrill to read. We will get into the intimidating literary stuff. I'll ask you about Kierkegaard and Balzac later. But just sort of reading some reviews this morning, one question that popped into my head was, while you're writing a book like this with, I believe, 7 narrators, essentially, so they all had to be finely drawn. When you're writing, do you have actual people, maybe actors, in mind? Does that happen later? Because I will tell you, the character of Frank Doyle, I have a very specific actor in mind for him. Do you have any idea who it might be?
Who is that? No, I'd
Brian
love to hear
Cox. Have you heard that before?
Oh, sure. Yeah, Brian Cox does that kind of the kind of person who I had in mind very well, and I think that would be a good fit. I don't have particular people in mind that I base sort of visually characters on. There's a scene early-ish in the book when they're all out on Long Island, and Justin Price has taken his boat across the bay to the Doyle's house, and he steps out on the dock, and his outfit is described, and that, not the moment itself, but the outfit on a friend who looks a fair amount like what I had Justin in my head looking like, is based on real life, and that's the only, I think, visual image in the entire book that is directly drawn from memory.
Well, from a technical sense, the structure of this book is, for me, as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, how did he do this? That's where sort of the magic comes in, I suppose. But I certainly never had any expectation that I would actually get to ask you this question. But as you're reading, the time is shifting as we shift narrators. And it took me a few chapters to realize, oh, he's actually going to pull this off. You know what I mean? Because it
Yeah, it
seemed
took me a
like
long
an
time
impossible chore. And I was wondering, reading it, did he have an outline, and is he comparing these different pages as he's writing to make sure that everything just sort of zips right up the way it needs to? Because it does seamlessly.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, when you've got a big sort of symphonic novel like this, I personally, I don't outline. I just kind of do all of that stuff in my head or through the process of drafting the book. But there's work you need to do on kind of continuity at various stages to make sure everything lines up. And what it means is when you change something at one point in the book, all of a sudden there's threads all over the place that you need to fix, and it's very labor intensive. I mean, that's the thing. As I very much appreciate hearing you say this, and I'm flattered. But as with a lot of things that maybe look like magic, it's really what it is a lot of labor.
Yeah.
You don't want to. You don't want it to read like it was hard work. There's certain kinds of novels. I actually am deeply enmeshed in an essay I'm writing about a novelist named William Gaddis right now, whose novels are being reissued, and he's one of my favorites. He's a wonderful novelist. But you get when you're reading them, you do have a sense of, man, this was hard work for him. It's just like so meticulous, and there's so much density to it, and there's a lot of just saying, like, how did he do this? And I appreciate very much you're saying that, but what, for this kind of novel, my hope is that the author isn't a presence in the book. You're not thinking as you go along, wow, how did he do this? What you're doing is just following through the characters.
Right. And I think that that's how it worked for me after the first few chapters. And I realized that it was all going to work, that it was all
Yeah.
going to come together. And I was never going to be confused. Wait, which month am I in? No, it doesn't. It is seamless. And I should say, too, that one of the things that people say about the book is that it's big, right? You've probably seen that many times,
Yeah.
because it's 500 some pages, but they're not dense pages. It's very, I picked it up and finished it in 4 days, and it was a pleasure straight through. It isn't by any means work, some sort of chore to finish the book. So I almost worry that people are misled when they see that it's a big novel. It's
Yeah, I would
expansive
also
and it's
say, I
themed.
mean, all these things are relative, of course, but to return to Gaddis because he's on my mind. The books that I just reviewed, one of them, The Recognitions, is 1,000 pages long, and then the second one, JR, is 750. And there is, when I think of a big book, um, that's what I think. I think 700, 800, 900 pages.
Right.
A 500-page book, which incidentally this book was at one point. In earlier drafts, it was about a third longer than it is now. But a 500-page book is definitely not a 300-page book. It's not a short novel. But it's not. It's been slightly strange to me to hear how many people remark on how big it is, because it's not 1,000-page novel.
Right.
Lots of novels are 500 pages.
Right.
So, and I mean, it's like I'm about 6'4". What I think of myself as, I am on the taller range of normal height. a 6'4", particularly if you're in a world of like athletes, which are 6'4" is not tall, But if you're in a world of just average people, 6'4" is tall. But this book is like a 6'4" book. It's not a 6'8" book. It's definitely not, Kristaps Porzingis.
Right. Well, let's talk about baseball a little bit. That's
Sure.
why I was invited to this party. So talk a little bit about the title, and you go beyond that. And I should mention that I'm sure someone somewhere has described this as a baseball novel because it's convenient to do that. It's not, but it does draw from and reference baseball, which was delightful for me. And you've done it with the title in a very specific way. If you look behind me, you can see my Bill James collection. So I was just wondering about your connection with that. And I believe I read somewhere that you actually contacted Bill and
I
asked him about
did.
the title.
I asked him, I said I was writing this book and that I was borrowing this title from his work. And he said, go for it. He was very nice about it. And then I sent him the book. And he read it, and he responded very nicely about it, which is something I really appreciated. And I would say it's been very gratifying to me that people like you and like Bill James, who were very important to me when I was sort of going through my intense sabermetrics kind of period, have appreciated the book, because there's some people who read it as essentially being kind of a satire of quantification, but that's not how I intended it. That is to say, I don't. To me, there's broadly speaking two views of the world that are being represented in the book. One that has more to do with intuition, and one that has more to do with statistical analysis. But there isn't one view that, in my opinion, that wins out over the other
Right.
in the book. That's not the point of the book, to make an argument for one or the other. So people in, let's say, the kind of literary world that I occupy, they're naturally going to be more on the side of the intuition, the romance of things, mythologizing, etc. And so they sort of think of it as, oh, there's these numbers guys in there, then they're there to be the kind of butt of the jokes. But that isn't how I intended it. So I really appreciate the fact that people who are from that world have enjoyed the book and get that. I would hope that what you get from reading it is partly that this is a stuff that I really did absorb myself. Right. You couldn't write from a character like Sam Waxworth without actually having lived through a lot of that and been deeply in it. So anyway, I suspect that many of the people in the crowd have read the book or been to some of these events before, but just to say briefly, the Index of Self-Destructive Acts is a statistic that Bill James created himself, which essentially involves taking a whole bunch of relatively rare instances where pitchers do things entirely independent of the batter to screw things up, basically. Balks are very, very rare instances. How often one pitcher who, the pitcher who balks the least in a season, there's many who it happens 0 times. The pitcher who balks the most probably balks twice, So there isn't anything statistically significant in ranking pitchers according to the box, but the idea was you take a bunch of these. You take balks plus wild pitches plus hits batsmen plus errors, and you lump them all together. And assuming there's any correlation along with them, then all of a sudden you get a sense that certain pitchers never beat themselves and certain pitchers aren't very, So it basically is trying to combine all of the ways that a pitcher beats himself without any any help from the batter. So the first thing is, it's just he came up with this idea of combining these things, but he also came up with this name for the stats, and it's just a wonderful name.
Right.
And the first time I read about it in his historical baseball abstract, I thought, I've got to use that as a title, and I had the title long before this sort of coalesced. But secondly, I think most novels, most literature has some element of characters behaving in self-destructive ways in it. There's in a previous era, what a lot of what literature was about was sort of epic heroes going out into the world and facing all these external challenges. But in the era of the novel, you're much more likely to have the challenges be psychological, have the challenges be internal, have the challenges be, the ways that we act against our own interests, or our inability to know what we actually want, or the fact that we want different things that are mutually conflicting, et cetera, et cetera. And so I loved it in part because it seemed to me that almost every novel could be described as an index of self-destructive acts. That's what novels trade in. So the name applies to more or less the storylines of every character, even the ones that have nothing to do with baseball. But I think that would be true. It's not because once I had the name that I thought, okay, I've got these 7 characters and each one of them has to behave in self-destructive ways. I just think that's how people behave in novels for the most part. And it's also, I think, to a large degree, how people behave in life. So.
Was it a sort of eureka moment when you hit upon that title for this book? Because it's an incredibly catchy title.
Yeah, it's so as I said, the first time I read, it's got to be 10 years ago or plus that I first read. No, I know exactly when it was. It's 16 years ago that I read this line, and I don't know if I'd seen it before, but I remember the time I read it and said that would be a great title for a book. I wrote 3 other books in the meantime. I wasn't searching for the story that was this, that would go with this title. But then the book is set in 2009, and around that time or soon after, I became very interested in Nate Silver, who, as you know, was involved in the world of baseball analytics before he got involved in the world of political prognostication, which is what he's most famous for now. And 2008 was the first election where he did that, and he sort of became known, particularly in the world of kind of stat heads, including political junkie stat heads, before he was hired by the New York Times, before he started 538. But he started to get a following, and then he became more famous after that election. And I was very interested in that, in the way that this method that had been evolved for talking about a game, that is self-contained, that has all sorts of elements that games have that allow them to be amenable to this sort of quantification, and then applying it to the world at large, and in the process, sort of treating politics like a game. But anyway, there was just a lot of things that interested me about it, and so I started thinking about writing about a character like that. And then very soon after, I got this other character, the Frank Doyle character, who's more of a mythologizer type, and I started thinking about ways to bring them in contact with each other. And it was very soon after that I had this moment where I was like, oh, this is when I'm finally going to get to use this great title that I've had banging around for a long time.
So Frank at one point says, or maybe he thinks, the numerarchy ruled everything now. And I'm sure someone reading the book, if they want to read that as an indictment, they can. But of course, it's just this character who has those thoughts. But ultimately, all the characters sort of realize that nothing rules everything except their own emotions and foibles. In the Kirkus review, uh, I forget who this was, but wrote of you in the novel. He's concerned with how irrationality can undermine us and push us closer to understanding ourselves. And I was wondering, to me, that sentence makes more sense if the and is sort of separate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It should read, he's concerned with how rationality can undermine us and push us. They're sort of separate thoughts in my mind.
No, I
And
think there's. Sorry, if I can just jump in, I would say one thing about irrationality, and it is in a way irrational to think that we can completely succeed in rationally organizing life, right? One of the if I can step back and get kind of historical and abstract for a second, right? The the one of the key figures of the early Enlightenment is Immanuel Kant, and he starts by saying with his critique of reason, right? And the idea right away is, if we are going to operate based on reason, first of all, we need to figure out what the limits of reason are. And so built into the Enlightenment project very early was this sense that there were limits to what could be discovered through reason, with how nature could or cannot be conquered by reason, with what we can do with reason. There's limits to what we can know. And that was a really important component to the whole project. And at a certain point, for many people, that got lost. And so, but the idea that everything is knowable, or knowable by individuals with their limited perspectives through reason, is itself a fundamentally irrational idea. So that's one of the things that I wanted to sort of grapple with, is that it's not a simple matter of saying there's reason on one side and there's irrationality on the other side, because there is a kind of application of reason that is itself irrational.
now you've written, I believe, 3 novels: 2012, What Happened to Sophie Wilder; 2014, Arts and Entertainment. And my understanding is that these books all exist in the same Christopher Beha universe, with a few shared characters, at least in a tertiary way. And the things you were just talking about, do those sort of apply across that universe? Is this an underlying theme, or is it something you just turned to in the latest novel?
It's mostly that particular theme, I think, is mostly in this book. There's also like something that I should mention, which is that when you do events like this, or just in general, you spend all this time writing a book and then you start talking about it. A lot of the stuff that you wind up saying about the book, about the theme, about it, essentially your interpretation of your own work,
right,
arrives after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I have come to think about the book in the 4 months or whatever it's been since it's been out. So it is not it's not that I sat down to work out these themes. To me, if you're going to do that, you sit down and write an essay. I sat down to write a novel, and what I wanted it to be above anything else was an engaging story for people. And then
Have you ever read a review and thought, "Hey, this guy makes a lot of sense"?
Yeah, I mean, there's a good. I think a good book will be available for certain kinds of readings that the author didn't intend. I did an event where I was in your shoes last week, and I was interviewing a novelist named Peter Cameron, who I admire very much. And what's very interesting about Peter is he's a very intuitive writer. I'm a very analytical writer. So I think through, as I said, like I've got this character, and now I need to bring him in contact. I need something to happen, and so I'm going to make X, Y, and Z decisions. And I really, I plan it out on the page, but for the most part, I can justify my decisions if forced to. I can say, well, I did this because I wanted this to happen in this way, and I wanted to create this effect, and whatever. And even when I wasn't wholly conscious of it, I can almost always come up with some sort of like post hoc justification in an interview like this. But Peter, who's a wonderful, wonderful novelist, whose books I recommend to everybody, I asked him about certain things. Why was there this character, and did this happen to him? And he would just sort of say, I don't know. That's what happened when I was writing, and then it felt right, and and I think there's a lot of writers who do operate in that way, and then they really leave it up to critics to get into what it does or does not mean, or what the themes are, or whatever. They just they sit down and they get in the flow of things, and things start happening, and that's it. I'm not that kind of writer, and I think there are times where I wish I was more of that kind of writer, to be honest. But it does mean that I can talk about my own book is somewhat in the way that like a critic would, but it's not quite that way when you're doing the work.
And what led you to set all three novels in the same world?
I mean, the honest. I mean, I could say that I'm a big fan of Balzac, who you mentioned before. I like this idea of a comedy humaine where these different. I like that effect. As a reader, I like that effect, reading from book to book, and there is something to all of that. But also, it's just once you've created a world, it's a handy thing to have.
Right.
And what happened when I finished the first book, the first novel, I had no intention of returning to any of these characters. And then the second novel, which involves a failed actor who sells a sex tape of his with his ex-girlfriend, who has become a famous actress. I had this idea, and I sat down to write, and I realized that I had a failed actor. There was a party scene in the earlier book where there's a character who's described as someone who is like in the occasional Law and Order episode, and I didn't put him there for any reason. It was typical at that point in my life, at a certain kind of party that you'd go to in New York, that there was someone who had been in a Law and Order episode, was doing some downtown theater stuff, was doing some student projects, and then had been in a Law and Order episode. So I just stuck him in the party. But then I realized, well, that guy 10 years later, or whatever it was, 5 years later, that's exactly what I need. That's what this book needs. So I don't have to make up a new guy. And then I realized that I also had in the other book the character who he would then go to if he had this tape he wanted to sell. Then having done that, I realized there was a lot of fun to it, and I had some sense that I probably would do it again. And so in the second book, there are a few notes that do exist in order to seed things for the third book. But I suspect that there are at least one or two continuity errors between the three, because what you don't want to do is tie your hands, and when you're doing, particularly, I've already got the challenge, as mentioned, with this book, of making everything internally consistent. With a book this big, with these many characters, that's a real challenge. The last thing I needed to do was add the additional challenge of going back to make sure everything lined up with the previous two books. And luckily, this isn't Star Wars. I don't I don't have enough passionate fans who are going to write me letters saying, Justin was in the same year as Blakeman in this book and was the year behind him in this book, or whatever it is.
So the first section, you mentioned Balzac. The first section of your book is called "The Young Man from the Provinces," which I believe is lifted from Balzac. And I'm just taken with that phrase. I think it turned up in Succession. I have to think you watched Succession. It seems like something you would enjoy.
I didn't see it turn up in Succession. I watched the first few episodes of it, so I do have some.
Well, it's possible that I read your book and then realized that one of the major characters in Succession is literally a young man from the provinces. But it's just such an evocative phrase, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit about why you wanted to use it.
It's sort of a it's a type in realist novels of the tradition that I was sort of conscious of working in. That you have, and it's very in Balzac and Zola and Maupassant, in a number of French writers, you have this type of the young man from the provinces is anywhere outside of Paris, basically, right, who comes to Paris, and in those, and very often they involve characters who come to Paris to become artists, to become writers, to get involved in journalism, So I had this. It occurred to me pretty early on in this way that I, as I said, I can be sort of analytical about my own work, that Sam was a young man from the provinces type character, and that I was working in that tradition. But then it also occurred to me that I had these other characters who were highly literary in a highly self-conscious way, and that they would recognize that that's what Sam was, and that they would remark on it, and that it would just be a sort of a fun way to add some sort of self-reflection into the book. Right. So he gets, and the other thing is, the Times reviewer said something about how, I don't pin the characters down, but the characters are all trying to pin each other down. And I was aware of this idea of them all, various of the characters treating each other as types in a certain way. Whereas in reality, none of us are exactly our type, So Sam is not the young man from the provinces, even though that's who Margot would see him as. He's not merely the sort of like cold calculating sabermetrics analytic type, even though that's who Frank would see him as. Right. And the same is true for the other characters. They are not just their types. And that's one of the things that interested me in the project, was creating characters who fit within certain types, and then creating opportunities for them to act against type at certain moments.
Well, you mentioned the Times review. It, like every other review that I was able to track down, was rapturous, including the National Review of all places. I love the quote from Nell Zink on the back of the book. For me, this encapsulated the book perfectly. A book's worth of thoughtful essays folded into a kick-ass novel, which is just perfect.
Yeah,
that's probably every novelist's dream. What's it been like publishing something that you spent years and years on in these weird times?
Let me say something that I'm sure I shouldn't say. It's a terrible mistake, but I'm just going to do it because I'm sitting in my living room at 10 o'clock at night, and it doesn't. So why not? So Nell Zink, who I have great affection for, and is a wonderful, wonderful writer, and is also she's a bit of an eccentric. I sent her my book, and she started reading it. And she wrote to me, and she said, "This is really surprisingly good." It's. I think she might have even said it's exceptionally good. That's what she said. This is exceptionally good. I thought, this is great. Maybe Nell Zink will write me a blurb. So I asked her, would you write me a blurb? And she said, sure. So she came back with this blurb that you just read, saying a book's worth of thoughtful essays folded into a kick-ass novel. And I was like, that's really nice. That's a nice description. What would really make it great is if it could be exceptionally good, and then the rest of the blurb. So I emailed her and I said, well, earlier you said the book was exceptionally good. Do you think I could just throw that into your blurb? Would you mind? And she said, well, I just meant exceptionally compared to your other work. I was really surprised because I didn't care for your other novels, and I really like this novel. But I wouldn't want it to be misunderstood as a more general statement. So why don't we just stick with the blurb I gave you? So anyway, that's how I wound up with Nell Zink's blurb.
That's great.
As for the rest of it, you're publishing a book into this environment now. It's strange to be doing it where you don't see people in person, where you don't get to have real events. One thing I will say about this book is, just speaking sincerely, is if you spend 6-7 years on a book like this, your hope is that it will last a little bit.
Right.
You're not writing it to get a big readership for 2 months and then have it be over. And so it's my hope that it will survive. It'll come out in paperback. It's my hope that 10 years from now, some people are picking it up and discovering it, etc. So on that level, you can live with the fact that it did not come out in ideal circumstances, but certainly it didn't come out in ideal circumstances. There's no getting around that.
So what's your journey as a baseball fan? When did you really pick it up as a passion?
Very early. I have a twin brother to whom this book is dedicated, and he and I were huge baseball fans, huge Yankees fans from a very young age. But we were Yankees fans because we grew up in New York and we grew up with parents who'd been Yankees fans. But we grew up in the 80s in one of the very rare, really the only period in New York history since the Mets were founded in the '64 expansion, where the Mets were the team.
Right.
Mattingly was great, but the 80s Yankees were a mess in all sorts of ways, the 80s into early 90s. And, the 86 Mets were World Series champs, and Strawberry and Gooden were young and great players before their respective sort of self-destructions. And so anyway, all of that is to say is we actually grew up as Yankees fans who were obsessed with the team's history. At a time where they weren't actually very good. One of the few periods you could be, I guess the other one is the mid to late 60s, early 70s, where you could be a Yankees fan and not ever have the experience of them being the best team in baseball. Mm-hmm. So we loved baseball, but we really loved baseball history. We really loved, talking about, reading about the Yankees teams of the 50s, the Yankees teams of the 20s. We got very interested in, we had our baseball encyclopedia, and we just, say, I wonder, what Hank Bauer's career average was or something, and just go look it up, and then we just have a conversation about Hank Bauer. So anyway, it was Frank, who is the kind of nostalgist, mythologizer. We had a lot of that in us. but for him, he's nostalgic for an era that he lived through. We were nostalgic for something that we had not at all lived through.
And why did you choose the Dodgers and Mets as Frank's teams instead of your Yankees?
I there are a couple of reasons. The first is that I wanted it to be a Dodgers fan because that experience of the Dodgers leaving was so sort of psychically traumatic for so many people of that age, and I think it is an important part of his character. And it's an important part of his character that he becomes this Mets fan, but the Mets are really a kind of echo of, his real team. And it's important that it serves to kind of freeze in amber some earlier period in his life. And then, the other thing, and this is the kind of thing that I think of, which sounds sort of silly, but the pretense is that he's kind of the most famous Mets fan in the world. He's like the signature Mets fan,
Right.
And you have, for the Yankees, during this period, you had, Giuliani sitting behind home plate with, like, I don't know, Billy Crystal or whoever. I mean, the Yankees, there's a lot of people who are like known as Yankees fans.
Right.
But I sort of thought also that the people would say, oh, sure, this guy who's like a political columnist for the major paper would be like the Mets fan who gets invited up into the booth and all that stuff. If he were a Yankees fan, he'd be just any other Yankees fan.
Well, and one of the central incidents in the book sort of drives a lot of the narrative is, and I'm not going to summarize it, I'll let you do that, but is the ballpark incident. I say that in quotes because that's how you describe it, or how the characters describe it. That incident resonates even more now today, I think, than when you wrote it, right? Quite a lot more. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts have been as you've seen all these things happen. So-called cancel culture, Black Lives Matter, in just the last few months. Does that sort of give you a different perspective on what you wrote?
Yeah, so what happens is that Frank gets invited up into the booth for a Mets game. It's it's the end of the last season at Shea Stadium. He has not. He often goes up to the booth, but he has not been expecting it this time, and he sort of has a little too much to drink at the game. He goes up drunkenly into the booth. It's during the election, and he makes a racist joke about Obama. And it leads to him losing his job and all these other things. The person I had in mind with that particular incident was Don Imus. And really, he said these very nasty things about the Rutgers women's basketball team. And what was interesting about that moment was that, because I remember when a whole bunch of people sort of turned on him who had been longtime guests of his, and then it was particularly Gwen Ifill saying to some of her NBC colleagues who had been going on the show, where were you when he called me the cleaning lady 5 years ago? And basically what had happened was Imus had not gotten worse. He had not transgressed. The line had moved.
Right.
And in that case, I think there was no question that the line had moved for the better, that the line had moved to a more reasonable place. But certainly what happened is a lot of people who thought it was their job to be provocative in certain ways, then realized that if you spend your life testing the line, plus the line's moving, you're going to cross it, and then there's going to be these consequences. And so there started to be these consequences that now it happens quite a bit more. And it's a little eerie. Frank makes this comment. He leaves the booth, and then Tim McCarver and Joe Buck, who are, of course, real broadcasters, then proceed after he's left to do damage control, where they essentially sort of trash him and say there's no place for that in the game, etc. And one could have imagined that happening. But very recently, as I'm sure you know, this Reds broadcaster was caught on a hot mic saying something offensive just last week, and proceeded to do that to himself. I mean, he then, when they came back from commercial, he said, "I'm taking the headphones off. I don't know when I'm ever going to be back. There's no place for what I just said," So, I mean, this stuff definitely does happen. The world of 2008, 2009 that this is set in is kind of pre what we would now call cancel culture. And so I wasn't trying to make a commentary on it now. It was of its time, and I think it's much more about a figure like Frank, who feels entitled to say these things and then ultimately has to pay the consequences, than it is about the sort of like the culture that wants to limit his free speech. It's not that kind of statement.
Right.
And I was struck, one of the reviews. What was it? Essentially, one of the reviewers, who may have been in one of the more conservative outlets, kind of took Frank's side in describing it. They were like, and then Frank Doyle loses his job after an attempt at humor goes sour or something.
Oh, please.
But he makes a racist joke. I mean, it's supposed to be racist. It's not supposed to be. You're supposed to by the end of the book, there's various ways where you are supposed to sympathize with Frank, but you're not supposed to think that that he got a bum deal in this area. That's not what's going on for me.
Right. And I'm not a big fan of the term cancel culture, but the notion that there's a line where if you cross it, you could lose your job, that's been around for a long time.
Yes.
Al Campanis, back in the 1980s, most famously, at least in baseball, Bill Maher lost a network television program. That was
I was thinking
2002.
about people like Bill Maher, Don Imus. It was definitely happening back then. It wasn't. Yeah.
But the line probably moves faster and more radically now.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit harder for people to know exactly how far they can go.
Yeah. I wanted to leave time for Christopher to read.
Oh, great.
Okay.
I have so many questions, and I want to hold off. I'll probably email you privately.
Okay.
This is an amazing. I love seeing the two of you together having this tete-a-tete, because this is a great event for us. We're a tiny bookstore, 1,500 square feet. So I'm very appreciative of you showing up.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be doing it, and I'm glad to be remotely in Portland, the home of my beloved publishers, Tin House Books.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you
Portland
about Tin House.
Yeah, so Tin House used to be. There used to be a magazine as well, and it was bi-coastal. And so they had a Brooklyn office and a Portland office. And many years ago, I interned for Tin House magazine. So that is how, and I was a reader of the magazine, as anyone who was trying to be a fiction writer circa 2004, 2005, during this period would have been. So anyway, I loved Tin House and was sort of in the Tin House family for a long time, and then they published my first novel, and it was just an amazing experience. And because of that, I wound up making a number of trips to Portland to be at the Tin House, at the workshop and stuff like that. So it's a special place to me on that front. So I'm glad to be doing this.
Yeah, I agree. They're partners.
I would be there. I
they
suspect
do
it's
beautiful work.
Yeah,
by the way.
it's a great cover. It's amazing. I'm thrilled. Yeah.
It's an awesome cover.
So should I'll just read like a page or something? Yeah,
I mean, we have plenty of time, so read as long as you would like.
Okay.
I know we set an hour. We usually do like an hour 15, an hour and a half. So, and I'm waiting for the audience to ask questions, but
Okay.
haven't seen
Well,
any.
I know that I have family members in the audience, and I know that they are not shy. So if you would like questions, I'm sure that they can kick it off by. So I'm going to charge them with. I'm going to read one page, and by the time it's done, one of them will have submitted a question to kick off the audience questions. So we already kind of set this up because we were just talking about what happened to Frank. But anyway, he has the ballpark incident that happens at the end of the 2008 season of the last game at Shea Stadium. And then Sam Waxworth, this character we've been discussing, arrives in New York to work for this magazine, The Interviewer. And he gets assigned to do a profile of Frank. And the editor sends them to the first game at Citi Field, the Mets' new stadium, for the profile. So this is Frank, who's he's very proud. He's very resistant to apologizing, to submitting himself to all of the sort of ritual of self-flagellation that you need to do to recover from a moment like this. So he initially refuses to participate in the profile, but he changes his mind. And this is him on his way to the stadium for the game. Before Blakeman's offer, Blakeman is the editor. He hadn't planned to attend the opening of Citi Field. For the first time in 4 decades, he didn't have season tickets, and he hadn't been sure he'd go to the new park at all. That the great debacle had happened during the last game the Mets ever played at Shea had felt strangely fitting. His days as the team's most famous fan, a familiar fixture in his seats behind home plate, sure to appear on the Jumbotron at some point during every home game, invited often into the announcing booth and twice onto the field to throw out the first pitch, were over. As if in recognition of the fact the stadium where he played that role had been torn down. He knew some people found him solipsistic, but in this case the symbolism really was striking. Who could blame him for avoiding the new home they'd erected in his reputation's ruins? What changed his mind was the prospect of facing off with this kid. Like everyone else, Frank had read Sam Waxworth's election posts. He'd seen his projections down to the 10th of a percentage point of a near landslide for Obama. Without mentioning Waxworth by name, Frank had even written a column, his last as it turned out, about why those projections would be proven wrong. Just as the baseball stat heads thought they could make their judgments without scouting, without going to games and getting real human eyeballs on players in the field, the political stat heads thought they could make predictions without reporting. But polls couldn't capture a mood. For that, you needed to look around a bit. The country, Frank had decided after attending several rallies, was skittish. At such moments, people opted for experience. They might like the idea of voting for a handsome, well-spoken black man. They might tell pollsters that this was what they planned to do, but in the secrecy of the voting booth, they wouldn't pull that lever for someone who hadn't completed a full Senate term. The role of commander-in-chief required a figure who was battle-tested. Battle-tested was the column's head, and that meant McCain. If Frank had been right about any of this, he sometimes thought, the fallout from his performance at that game would have passed quickly enough. Obama would have been forgotten, and insulting him in jest would have come to seem a venial sin. Frank would have earned credit for being right about the election, not to mention the war, and the Herald would have been forced to take him back. Instead, something like the opposite had happened on every count. While the online mob was picking gleefully through the corpse of Frank's career, this kid with a calculator was getting nearly as much credit for the victory as Obama himself, as though he'd conjured the results into being rather than just adding up and dividing other people's work. After a bit of reflection, Frank recognized Blakeman's proposal for what it was, an opportunity to show that he was still unbroken. He finally had what the Herald had owed him but hadn't offered, the chance to justify himself. The numerarchy ruled everything now. It had long ago taken over his wife's world, the world of finance, convincing everyone that computer modeling could eliminate risk, an idea that had led to some of the most irrational behavior in human history and taken the whole economy down. It had half ruined the first love of his life, baseball, and now it had set sights on the second, politics. These people were the enemy. How could he pass up the chance to spend 9 innings with one of their kings? Okay. So now I think we've got questions.
You're muted, Chris.
That's because there's some weird beeping in my store that I can't figure out where it is. But I do, you reading that passage, and I feel a little teary, is, it's the Republican National Convention. That's what we're competing with tonight. Donald Trump's closing statement. I mean, did you pick that on purpose? Because that's super poignant, right? Like in this moment in time, like, how could you know? History repeats itself. Like,
there's a lot of things about the book that if I had, so I was about halfway through the book or thereabouts in when the 2016 election happened. And it was a very strange thing to be in the midst of writing a book that was in part about this election prognosticator at this time where everyone got it so badly wrong. And I really struggled with what to do about that. But the nice thing was that, there's a certain kind of literary novel that's set in the contemporary world that's just sort of set in the vague present.
Right.
And that's certainly at a time where, in a lot of the 19th century novels that I love and was thinking about, they would say, in towards the middle of the last decade, they'll say, or they'd say in the year 1820 dash, they do this thing where they very specifically are not telling you exactly when, but they're giving you it was around this time. And things moved slowly enough that you could just do that, and the way people dressed wasn't, pegged to, or what music they were listening to wasn't pegged to like a particular month, but this novel was very specifically set in this time period right after the 2008 election. So for that reason, it helped a lot when thinking about what to do post-Trump, which is I did nothing. I knew when this book was set. It wasn't, and what I had to avoid was any kind of cheap irony,
Right.
of sort of overplaying what I knew as an author in 2016, 2017. 2018, and putting that into a book set in 2009. But it's this stuff winds up. So there were ways when I was writing it in 2016 where I thought, if I'd been a little quicker, this book could be out now, and I would seem like a prophet, but I wasn't. But then there, things happen in 2020 that make it seem relevant again. I think the beeping is coming from me, by the way.
Oh, it's not me.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Okay. I walked all around my store. I'm like, what's beeping? Okay, so we have now 5 questions. 4 of them are from your family. How are you experiencing the pandemic baseball?
Yeah, so I have not. That is from Rob, but the truth is that I have not watched a single game of this pandemic season, in part because I had my second child in March, so I just don't have the the bandwidth for it. One of the things that, Rob, I know you are aware of, but that maybe people who are not big baseball fans don't realize is that baseball games are very long. It is something that is very much discussed as a problem within the world of baseball, and it is a problem. It's, games, and if the Yankees play for various reasons that are great for them as a team in terms of their style of play, but they play the longest games.
Right.
So a game, if the Yankees finish a game in under 3 hours, that was an unusually short game. So anyway, it's just I have this book out, and I have my two children, and the result of that is that I experience baseball by getting up in the morning and going online to find out how the Yankees did last night.
I think Rob probably does the same thing, because Olive has got to be a lot of,
There's not much baseball on television in my life, and hasn't been since she was born. There's a lot of listening on my iPhone to the radio broadcasts. That's my favorite way to enjoy baseball these days. Well, I'm going to the ballpark.
a little.
Yeah, going to the ballpark.
Yeah.
Would be great. Would be great for sure. And I used to think of myself as someone who watched very, very, very little television, and then I realized that for 6 months out of the year, I spent 3 or 4 nights a week watching 3 hours of television a night.
For me, it was 6 or 8. Yep.
Yeah. So.
Katrina Levine asks, do you believe that sports holds a significance in our culture outside of entertainment?
Well, sure. I mean, I think obviously the moment we're in right now, you see, with the boycotting of the games in the NBA bubble, the boycotting of games by some baseball teams. Sports has an enormous cultural impact, and it is absolutely culturally important that so many of the most prominent people of color in our country, the ones with the largest audiences, the ones with the loudest voices, the ones with who people hold in the highest regard across the political spectrum, are athletes. And there has been there were always athletes who used that platform for political activism, including obviously Muhammad Ali, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was very long, very politically active. But then there was also the type of like Michael Jordan, whose response about speaking out on race is Republicans buy sneakers too. And we're now in a moment, obviously, where that's not where LeBron James is. That's not where. So to have in basketball in particular, the best players with the highest profiles are being leaders on these issues. So social justice, I think it's been a huge cultural change, and I think it is a very important part of the moment.
I think the moment is really, I know personally I'm struggling with the uncertainty, right? And if you think about, so this is a benefit for Roosevelt High School. Those baseball players who are hoping for a scholarship and possibly, becoming professional players, what happens to that? They're not playing. It's so, the effects are generational.
I would just throw in something else that's a slight change of subject, but I think it's significant, and it goes back to the book. There's one character in the book besides Joe Buck and Tim McCarver who are actually drawn from life. Frank goes into his office, what used to be his office before he got fired, late in the book, in a building that's sort of based on the Times building. And there's a security guard named Prasad. And he gets in, and he's the guy he always talks to about the Mets games. that's based on an actual guy named Prasad, who was the security guard at my building in my office at Harper's Magazine, who was a diehard Yankees fan, which is what I am. And every morning, I'd get in the morning, and he'd say something, he'd reference something about the game the night before, and I knew what he was talking about, and we'd have a little conversation. And I don't know how, maybe he was wearing a Yankees cap one day, or I don't know how it came about that I figured this out about him. But, this is someone who I otherwise would not have had anything in common with or anything to talk about. And he would have been, for me, going into my office, just like the guy who sits at the security desk. I might have said hello to him, but we had real conversations. They weren't about our personal lives, but they were, we had a sense of connection. When he retired, I was sorry to see him go. He's someone who was in my, and there is, sports are one of the sort of great equalizers on class and social equalizers in this country, because it's rich people follow them, poor people follow them, people of all races follow them, and they all go to the games together. They in a place like New York, they all ride the same subway line to the stadium. So yeah, I think in all sorts of ways they're culturally significant.
So Brett Asbury, who joined us late, had a question about Justin. He says, I was struck by your characterization of Justin as an African-American character in a predominantly white book. Did you feel any racial burden in writing Justin? And in the light of changes since you wrote the book, do you feel that the burden has changed? I feel like that's a good question.
It's a great question. Yeah. Here's the burden I felt. I felt like it was important for me to get things right. And I felt like if I didn't get things right, I was going to hear about it from some people, and I felt deservedly so. That didn't feel like an undue burden. So there's these much larger conversations about cultural appropriation that get brought in when people write across their sort of identity position, let's put it that way, particularly when you're writing from the dominant position, when you're writing as a straight white male about characters who do not share those characteristics and have been historically relatively marginalized. My feeling is just that I don't ever think as an artist that there's certain experiences I'm not quote unquote allowed to imagine on the page. But I also don't think that I can just presume that all that counts is what I sit and imagine. I had to do research. I needed to try and get it right. I needed to accept that this was not my experience, and that if I wanted to put it on the page, there was, I had a responsibility to do the work. And I think that remains true. I think a lot of books that you read from say the 50s or 60s, where you see a white writer writing a black character, or a straight writer writing a gay character. One of the things that you no matter how sensitively they do it, I think it's generally pretty obvious that they understand that they are writing for a straight white audience, and so their only artistic response, the bar they have to clear, is this black character has to seem plausible, that I'm writing as a white man has to seem plausible to some other white man. Now you can clear that bar and write something that's not racist and not cultural appropriation and not offensive, but that's just not where the bar is anymore. Probably it's not ever where it should have been, but that's not where the bar is anymore. So I am aware when I'm writing that when I'm writing across from my own experience, that for some of my audience are going to be people who have actually had that experience. And if I get it wrong, they're going to know. And if I get basic stuff wrong, they're not only going to know it's wrong, but they're going to know that I didn't care enough to take the trouble to get it right. That I wanted to get the literary or emotional or aesthetic effect of having a character like this in my book, and I wasn't willing to do the work. And that's going to offend them, and rightfully so. So that's, I don't know, that it's a topic that obviously one could talk about it at great length. I went to a black storefront church in Crown Heights while researching the book because this character goes in his mother goes to one of these churches, and there's a scene in one of these churches. I had lived for a couple of years in Crown Heights, and I had often walked by these churches, and I became interested in them. And then I just kind of imagined one for the sake of the book. And then at a certain point, it occurred to me, you can't just imagine it, you got to go in. And that's just not good enough, and so I went in, and it was an amazing experience. And if I had not felt that burden of clearing the bar of, I want someone who actually goes to one of these churches to be able to read this book, rather than just having people who go to, my white church on the Upper East Side. If I hadn't had that burden, that maybe I would not have felt like I had to go into that church before I could write that. But I did. And so for me, I think that feeling that burden was a great benefit.
I want to read the question from your mom just because it's so cute. Do the characters deserve their self-destruction, or could they have escaped unscathed?
I don't know about deserved. I mean, there obviously is a sort of theological element to this idea that these characters are all that they're in a fallen state, that human nature, that we're naturally turned against ourselves in some way. But in part because it's nature, it's not really about what anyone deserves. And then, I mean, I don't want to sound glib, but whether they could have escaped their fate, the answer is no, because it wasn't up to them.
Because you wrote it.
Yeah. If they'd escaped their fate, it wouldn't have been an interesting book.
Yeah.
Happiness writes white is what they say. It doesn't show up on the page.
Yeah. Then apparently your dad has a question.
We're getting everyone in.
Talk about the serendipity of getting the first game tape and finding the cat incident at the ball.
Okay, I will say this because I think Rob will appreciate this. So I don't know whether there's no reason you would know this, but everything that happens on the field during that game and that scene actually happened. I got this, I got the recording of the game and on a DVD from Major League Baseball, and I watched it. I had already picked out, for structural reasons, that they were going to go to the opening of Citi Field. Beyond that, I knew nothing about this game. I knew I was going to take my character, who's the baseball mythologizer, and my character, who is the analytics guy, put them together at this game. In the fourth or fifth inning, a cat runs out on the field. Now, this is something that if you watch a lot of baseball, happens once in a while, but it's quite rare. And right. It's like that classic. If you're Frank Doyle, this is what baseball is. That doesn't wind up in the box scores.
Right.
But it just happened. So it was such amazing serendipity. And then the other thing that happened was the game got decided by a balk. The winning run was let in by a balk, and balks are very, very, very rare. When they happen, they tend to just move one guy, one base. I don't know how many games, how many times in the history of baseball, you have had the balk determine the outcome of the game, where the winning run is let in by a balk, but it is not a common occurrence. And I wanted to introduce this concept of the index of self-destructive acts into this conversation between them, and there was the book, just when I needed it. So it was amazing. This all happened very early in the process of my writing it, but it just made me. It really it made it feel like the whole project was kind of meant to be. It helped me through many years after that of difficult writing on the book. I had this sense of like, this book has to get out there because it's such a weird moment of serendipity.
So I want to read.
Well, that reminds me of a book that I wrote about in my last book. There was a book written 5 or 6 years ago called "The Beauty of Short Hops," and the basic thesis was that so many bizarre, wonderfully random things happen in baseball games that it's impossible to really predict what's going to happen or analyze the sport. And further, if you try to analyze the game with real rigor, you will lose the beauty of all those things. And of course, my argument is that all of those things can exist at the same time. And for me, the best way to enjoy baseball is to do all this rigorous analysis and at the same time celebrate all these crazy things that happen, like cats running on the field. Or there was a playoff game where a squirrel ran on the field. You probably remember that.
Yes.
And it actually might have affected the outcome of the game. There was a Yankees game where who was the pitcher who was attacked by bugs?
Oh yeah, Jabba Chamberlain.
Right, Jabba Chamberlain. Well, of course you can't analyze that, but that's what makes the game so wonderful.
Yankee one. I think it was also Dave Winfield on a throw in from the outfield. His throw hit a bird.
Yes.
And yeah.
So this sort of ties in. So my business partner, the bookstore is not just books. We have books and yarn. And the yarn part of the store is called Weird Sisters, but she is a baseball lover. And her question is, do you have a favorite baseball stat? So she knows we both know a lot about baseball. So.
Okay, I'm going to have to think about that. Maybe Rob can jump in first. He might have one sort of like closer to hand.
I don't have a favorite. I have a favorite number. How's that?
It's not the
number
same.
37. That's my favorite baseball number.
Why is that?
There's just something sort of cosmically amusing and random about it.
It seems kind of high for a baseball number.
Well, they've had to retire so many numbers that you ultimately have to get go a little bit higher. But I always pick 37 when I have a chance. And some of the more interesting, odd characters in baseball history had number 37, and you might think it's a coincidence, but I don't.
So the last question, it looks like in the list, is from James Crosley, and we're apparently competing in sizes of our bookstores. Could you comment on the future you see for the minor leagues in light of the efforts to shrink them?
Yeah, I mean, Rob probably knows more about this. I have a friend who is actually writing a piece for me at Harper's, where I'm editor, but he had a book contract that was going to involve him spending the season with this Appalachian League, and then first the season got canceled, obviously, but now the league is getting shut down. And I think it's been around for 100 years. But anyway, and the network of minor league teams is such an amazing thing that is unique to baseball, and they obviously do serve a function for the major league pipeline, but that is very much not the only function that they serve, and it's a real shame that they're being shrunk down this way, I think. I don't know, what Rob, do you?
Well, I think that in the short term, we're going to see a great deal of disruption, which is going to be a negative experience for the people who are disrupted, no question. There does seem to be a general consensus that most of the towns and cities that lose their baseball teams will wind up with some other baseball team, whether it's collegiate summer baseball or an unaffiliated professional league. And historically, cities that can support baseball teams wind up having baseball teams after losing one. So I'm actually pretty optimistic about most of those places still having baseball, either in the very short term or in the medium term. I don't think ultimately most of them just flat out lose baseball.
I just want to jump in and say this is a perfect example of like a person who has an emotional response to something that he is semi-informed about, and then another person who actually has the facts and is thinking about it in an analytically rigorous way.
Well, I was emotional too when all this started, but having had now almost a year to really think about it and find out what's actually going to happen, I wound up being somewhat optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that my friend who was writing this book has said that a lot of the people in these towns that had teams for this Appalachian League that is shut down have said we will have baseball in 2021.
Yep.
We'll figure out how we're doing it, but there is the support in the town to have a team, and we will figure it out. So
Right.
probably it won't be it maybe it was a 10-team league before, and it'll be like a 6-team league now, and it'll be independent, and whatever it is. But they are gonna, they got their ballparks, and they have their culture around their teams, and they're gonna figure out a way to do it.
Yep.
The quick picture I have is Susan Sarandon and Kevin Costner, but it'll happen.
We have most people think about minor league baseball in places that are a long way from major league teams, but we have a number of minor league teams here, and I live in Brooklyn, and there's a team in Coney Island, and my family goes every year, and one of the things is you can't bring small kids to Yankee Stadium because it's too expensive. You take them at 7:00 at night, and they watch 2 innings, and then and it's also like they're too far from the field to really appreciate all this stuff. And you can take them to a minor league game. You can sit right on the field. They can meet the players. You can put your name up on the scoreboard, and you can, if you want, walk out after 3 innings and feel like you're not, wasting, $100. So I love minor league baseball. I think there's a lot, but there's no question that it is an inferior product on the field. But
that whole, what you described right there is connection, right? Like how we become connected, right? Connected to our minor league team, our neighbors, our kids are now connected. It's an important part of sports, I think, right? That
absolutely, yeah.
You're connected. I will just give you, because I can't help it, a little tidbit. Growing up, I tried out for the boys baseball team. My mom made me go to all girls schools. So I tried out for the Lou Gehrig League, the boys baseball team. I made it because my sister and I were very athletic. We were very good. My dad said to me, girls do not belong in the dugout. And he put the kibosh on it. I didn't get to play baseball.
Well, that's awful.
We had now, but
we had, I think, there was one girl on our minor league team, my brother and my team, growing up. I mean, we would have had others, but I don't think there was a high interest. There weren't tryouts for the team. If you wanted to play, you played. But
but Lou Gehrig in New Jersey. I don't know. It was super fun. I loved it. I played softball. But Anyway, any other questions? It looks like we hit them all. Rob, do you have any last comments?
I just want to thank Chris for doing this. This has been so much
Thank
fun.
you very much.
I'm hoping he makes it to Portland so he can sign this
Yeah,
for
I
me someday.
would love it. And I'm just going to do this. I've got Rob's book, so people should pick up a copy of this.
At Two Rivers.
At Two Rivers, absolutely.
I have one.
Yeah. All right. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you so
really
much. And everything benefits Roosevelt High School athletic program. And this will be available for anybody to see afterwards. Thank you so much, both of you.
Christine, I will see you soon.
I have books for you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, Chris.
Bye.
Thanks.